Hello and welcome. My name is Richard Hobbs and I'm the Security and Justice Lead here in the UK. Welcome to those of you joining us online and welcome also to today's panel. As part of our Justice Reimagined series, we are here to talk about one of the world's most intractable problems, and that is illicit finance. Illicit finance is the money that is earned illegally, that is transferred, or is used to enable crime, and its scale is vast. According to the United Nations for Drugs and Crime, the amount of money laundered each year is estimated at 2 to 5% of global GDP, for a total of nearly $5 trillion annually. Now, to give that context, the total global defense budget is estimated at $3 trillion in 2023. So illicit finance is a complex, cross-border, cross-sector problem that impacts all parts of the global economy. It can cause immense harm to individuals, communities, taxpayers, governments, and society at large. It is often the most vulnerable in our society, the poor and the underrepresented, who are at greatest risk. Today, illicit finance criminal networks operate with speed, often outpacing the organizations tasked with stopping them. Many are expert at innovating and exploiting new ways to commit crime, ranging from online gaming to romance fraud. To hear more about the various ways to combat illicit finance, we have three panelists with multiple years of experience of working in this specialist domain. I'm honored to be joined by Annette Ryan, Khanyile, and Chris Bostock. So to get us started, can I ask each of you to do a quick introduction? So let's start with you, Xolisile.
Thank you. My name is Khanyile. I'm the chair of the Africa chapter of the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. I also occupy the position of the chair of the Financial Task Force of the United for Wildlife. Thank you.
Annette, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. My name is Annette Ryan. I'm Deputy Director of Partnership Policy and Analysis at FINTRAC, which is Canada's money laundering supervisor, as well as Canada's Financial Intelligence Unit. So with that dual role, we have a particularly unique ability to follow the money, and happy to talk to you this morning.
Fabulous. Thank you, Annette. And Chris, finally.
Thanks, Richard. Xolisile, Annette, lovely to see you again. So I'm Chris Bostock. I lead our global illicit finance program. So I lead all our research and thought leadership around illicit finance, work closely with governments around the world to help shape and implement policy reforms and also to develop innovative approaches to tackle illicit finance. And I come from a background in law enforcement, most of my time in the National Crime Agency or its precursors, involved in tackling this threat as well. And I thought, Richard, I'll just set the scene with a few reflections before we start the conversation. So I think from my position in both the public and the private sector, I've seen a number of systemic challenges that I think most governments, most societies face in relation to tackling illicit finance. There's 5 of them. The first is that the system is not a system. So what I mean by that is that there is an ecosystem of stakeholders that need to work together effectively to fight illicit finance. And at the moment, those stakeholders, public and private, don't come together sufficiently well. Second is around pace. Criminals move extremely quickly. They can move money across borders in seconds, for example, but tracing that money can take years. So there's a real inequality of arms in the pace with which we tackle illicit finance versus the pace at which it's committed. Third is that we often have the information and the intelligence that we need to tackle illicit finance in the ecosystem across the public and the private sectors, but often we don't share it quickly enough or at enough scale to be able to properly disrupt it. Fourth is that the scale is huge, but actually there is quite a lot of capacity in the system. If you think of all of the people and the money, particularly in the financial sector, that is expended tackling illicit finance, there's actually quite a lot of people, quite a big army out there. But that capacity is not always directed at where it can deliver the greatest outcomes. And that's linked to the final point around a reflection that the regulatory framework does not always incentivize activities that deliver outcomes against criminals. So today I'm looking forward to discussing some of the solutions to those challenges that we're seeing globally. I'll hand back to you, Richard.
Fabulous. Thank you for that, and thank you for the quick intros from all of you. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. So my suggestion is let's move into the first question, and that first question is around some of those topics that you just brought up there, Chris, and that is, how can public and private sectors better work together to address illicit finance? What are the gaps that need to be addressed, and where should we be seeking collaboration first? So Khanyile, I'm keen to get your thoughts on that one first of all.
Yeah, I'll start with a quote by David Lewis, the former executive secretary of the Financial Action Task Force, when he was addressing a conference in 2019 and saying we are seeing a number of good examples that are leading to the right outcomes or with a potential to do so. And this includes public-private partnerships that go beyond sharing typologies to sharing actionable intelligence without breaching data or privacy rules. Data is so critical in the fight against financial crime, but it doesn't help if you've got data and you hoard it and you don't share the information. As Chris have said, criminals share information, they learn to trust each other, they take a risk, and we can be able to fight and win this fight by being able to share information and trust each other in the public and the private sector. FATF has released a paper on this. FATF has released a paper in July 2022 looking at partnerships in the fight against financial crime. And it gives an examples of a lot of things that we can share. Information on customer identification and verification, information on beneficial information, information on transaction monitoring, information even on typologies, information on intelligence-driven inquiries, even information on sanctions. But the problem currently is that even if you look at the public sector alone, we believe it's a competition. I must show that I've been successful, instead of saying, let's work together and have a targeted approach. By a targeted approach, we established the Fusion Center in South Africa, which is a public-public partnership, located in one place in the FIC, where you've got prosecutors, investigators, intelligence, and FIU, your revenue service. If you work together and you are collaborated, you don't have to write a request and say, I need information from the revenue service. I need information from the police. You are able to bring your data in one room and you move with speed, you strengthen your case and you broaden your knowledge, you learn from each other, and you even appreciate the value that each and every one of you brings to the table.
Fabulous, thank you. And Annette, continuing on the theme of public and private partnerships, where would you take us? Where would you recommend we spend time?
Well, thanks so much, Richard. Ultimately, I think what Xolisile is describing and Chris is describing, in this idea that it takes a network to fight a network, is this idea that, we've done so much to build up with the private sector, and with financial intelligence units and supervisors, this exchange about, what typologies look like and how you can crack the veil of corporate secrecy and so on, that we're poised to be able to inform any number of the challenges that you opened with. So that could be serious fraud, that could be serious drug trafficking, human trafficking, tax evasions, customs issues, and so on, and at the scale that you described. But I think what we're also poised for is a period where we move our knowledge and expertise out of that community of experts and we really scale it up. Right. And so, in order to be able to be making the impacts that we need across a number of results, we've got to be able to make our financial intelligence and information work for non-specialists. And so, starting with that idea that Xolisile said so well, that information just doesn't share itself. What we need to do is really sort of be deliberate in orchestrating results-driven successes. So for the different entities that have to take the step of laying charges, getting prosecutions, seizing assets, other enforcement actions that can disrupt any number of these illicit activities, we need to line up what information they need to get their result. We need to work that backwards to know who's got that information, what patterns, what typologies, what indicators they need in order to be able to turn those financial records into reporting, us into financial intelligence, that financial evidence, and essentially line it up to get the information that people need to take that action at scale and turn the dial.
I'm always a big fan of that right to left thinking, starting with what information is needed at the end of the process and working backwards rather than the impossible task of going left to right in this world. So love that point. Chris, coming to you now.
Yeah, I just reflect on Xolisile's point around collaboration and physical collaboration in the fusion center in South Africa, and I think that's a great example of where by bringing people together you build trust and you break down the silos that exist between organizations that don't exist in the criminal world. So that building of trust through collaboration is key, and that, to my mind, always needs to happen across multiple domains as well. So we need to be thinking about how we build that collaboration, public sector to public sector. Public sector doesn't always share data with each other as well as they should. Public to private, also private to private. There's a number of different ways that all need to be brought to bear if we're serious about tackling this threat. That means exploiting the legislation that we have effectively. So there's new legislation in the UK around information. There's some new legislation in Article 75 under the new EU regulation. We need to make sure that we use that legislation and test it. And if it doesn't work, we go back to policymakers and we ask for better legislation or new legislation. We've got to use it, otherwise we won't get new legislation. And then the final point I would make is around making sure that that we consider the ecosystem and the sharing widely enough. So if you look at a problem like fraud, there are some challenges in the way that, for example, social media firms, telecoms, ISPs introduce the fraudster to the victim of fraud. Now, sometimes those organizations aren't necessarily as deeply embedded in the ecosystem as the historically regulated sector has been. So we need to think also about how we bring those new sectors in to the fight against illicit finance as well.
Fabulous. Thank you all. Off to a great start. Let's continue on that theme of collaboration and sharing and delve a little bit deeper into information sharing specifically. So the second question is, how can data be shared amongst stakeholders more effectively? And what kinds of risks need to be addressed to enable it? And this might be in the cross-border domain, or it might be in how we scale some of the existing information sharing partnerships that we've got. Again, Xolisile, do you want to just get us started on that particular question?
Even if we want to do the right things in government, in the private sector, we need to do the right things right. So it's very critical in a public-private partnership that we have enabling legislation. I must say in South Africa, when we established our public-private partnership, the SAMLIT, we didn't have legislation, but we had done our own research to look at whether the legislation that we had at that time was sufficient enough to cover the risk, and we were able to start. And we didn't start with just a public-private partnership that was focusing on trends and typologies. We were sharing information on live cases. But then we changed the law. We followed what US has done in the 314A. We changed the law, and we have a section that allows an FIU to establish a public-private partnership for the purposes of achieving its objectives. But what is very critical with a public-private partnership is that you ensure that whoever is leading it is not focusing on his or her institution's agenda. In the FIU, when we started it, we said we're taking issues of compliance. We're a regulator, but we are going to take issues of compliance outside of the public-private partnership, because we want everyone to be an equal. We want to trust each other, build trust, and we want everyone to be comfortable with sharing information. So it's critical that we have an enabling legislation, but it's also critical that you focus on real threats, serious threats that are impacting the country, because public-private partnerships are not going to solve everything. So you need to know what are the highest risk in your country. If you are looking at threats, what is a threat that you want to address or you want to mitigate. The risk in a public-private partnerships, the big nose. You need to ensure that in your public-private partnership, you've got a framework that deals with the security of information. You don't want to be sitting with the private sector and then the information that they share with you tomorrow, it's in the papers and you don't know who have leaked it. So you need to have people of integrity. You need to ensure that you've got a portal, a secured portal that you use for the sharing and exchanging of information. You need to define what success looks like, so that at the end of the day, you can be able to say, we are moving, we are doing better than before, or we are making an impact. You need to have law enforcement agencies buying into the public-private partnership, so that when banks are doing extra work on a voluntary basis, they are able to get feedback, because feedback loop is also very critical. They are able to get feedback that the information that we're able to collect that allowed us to put more pieces of the puzzle together and have a clearer picture on the transactions that are involved in this big case. We have been able to have our FIU preparing an actionable intelligence that has been sent to law enforcement agencies, and law enforcement agencies have prioritized that case. There's an investigation, there's an arrest, there's an asset recovery. Feedback loop is very, very critical. But also encrypt the information so that when there are leaks, you are not able to identify the sources of information. So de-identifying the information that you are sharing or having such tools is also very, very critical.
Yeah, and I've certainly heard a lot about feedback loops, not just in this particular domain of criminality, but across the full spectrum. Annette, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, we've been on a very similar path in Canada, as Xolisile has just described for South Africa. And your original question was about how you manage risks. I think the first step is to name them, and to be, again, very, very deliberate and orchestrated about surfacing the specific risks that people mean, and the specific proposals that they're bringing forward. When you say information sharing, that's a very big space. And it makes it very, very hard to be, really informative about, okay, well, what does a privacy risk look like? What does a legal risk look like? If you don't have that specificity of, well, who is going to share what with whom, for what purpose, using what technology? And so I would say, like South Africa, Canada, working with our banks, working with our police, our policy leads and so on, we really focused on the need to be able to share information in that private to private space. So bank to bank, bank to crypto, any number of configurations. But, when we sat down to work through what possible legislative changes could look like, we each had a different model in mind about, what that information sharing would look like. And in turn, bringing this to our privacy authority, they said, well, these are, these are very big, areas that you're opening up. How can we make it manageable so that we can build the right guardrails for privacy and legal protection and so on? So we developed a legislative approach in Canada that's been passed by our parliament in June of 2024 that will allow private sector entities to bring forward proposals under a code of practice for ex-ante approval by our privacy authority, in order to have that really, really practical discussion about what information is proposed to be shared against what threat, using what technology, among whom, with what guardrails, so that we can be absolutely surgical about the risks and essentially follow a very simple approach of name a problem, solve a problem, and tailor the authorities that you're seeking to kind of the size and nature of the risk that you want to tackle.
Fabulous. Chris, any thoughts on this particular topic?
Yeah, just a couple of reflections. I agree with all of the above. So Xolisile is very practical guidance around the setting up of PPPs, and Annette's commentary around the balance between privacy and investigation. And that is one of the areas that I think does often hold things back. So I think being really clear around the fact that the fundamental right to privacy and your fundamental right to be protected from crime don't necessarily need to sit in opposition to each other. They can be reconciled, and if reconciled effectively, preserving privacy, but also delivering better outcomes for the public. I think there's also a couple of other reflections I would make. Is one, we need to learn when we're thinking about information sharing, and particularly the sharing of sensitive data, is learn from where it's been done successfully elsewhere. So if I look, for example, in the CRS system, so that's the sharing of taxpayer data in order to ensure revenues in different countries are not abused by tax evasion. That's sharing really sensitive data. So what were the policy arguments that were made around sharing that kind of data, and how can we apply them in the context of the AML world and the fraud world as well? And then my final point I would make is around my experience of building information sharing partnerships is that it's really hard, and a lot of hard yards are spent building the frameworks to allow disparate data to be brought together. I don't think personally that we make enough use of where data already sits in aggregation, for example, in the payments architecture, cross-border payment systems, for example, making sure that PPPs, information sharing partnerships, build on some of that already aggregated data to expedite and accelerate outcomes is also an area I think we should consider.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense to make use of what's already available and are already brought together. I completely agree with that. Right, let's go on to our third topic, and that is within this world of illicit finance, this complex world. There's one particular element that is seen to be uniquely challenging, and that is the world of asset recovery. Again, it's an area where we can collaborate across private and public to innovate, to improve the outcomes. So, Annette, I'm keen to understand, what do you think would be key to improving our ability to recover assets across the system, across the globe?
Yeah. It's not a different answer, Richard, right? It's a question of, identifying the people that are responsible for that outcome. And, they're not, a consolidated group, right? So FATF has been pushing different countries to think more carefully about civil asset forfeiture as well as criminal asset forfeiture. So non-prosecution based versus prosecution based asset forfeiture. And, how that plays out in Canada is that responsibility is actually at the provincial level of government. So, in the question of how could we be more strategic in bringing forward the civil asset forfeiture that's not prosecution based towards results, we did a lot of listening, which is very old school as well. It's not always a big technological solution that you want, but essentially listening for those risks on the ground and building the trust that Xolisile spoke of towards the question of what information would those colleagues need in order to be able to use the information and the authorities that they have to seize not just proceeds of crime, but instruments of crime. And those legal instruments have a much lower threshold of proof than in the criminal setting. But in working through what you need to get those results and those partnerships, it's really a different set of problems than you need to solve than working at the front end around typologies. It's more along the lines of routing information to the right office and putting in place, the governance mechanisms to deconflict, who's going to take what action and who can, be in charge of different decision points, when you have police working in a very, sensitive area. And I think the aspect of naming the outcome that you want at a strategic level when you've got, maybe competing objectives, and then just, building the trust, deconflicting them, and then serving them the information that they need will get you there. And I think in the Canadian setting, that's led us to have better partnerships, but also a change in laws, whereby the provincial civil asset forfeiture offices have now been named as disclosure recipients through our federal regime. And, and I think, that reflects both the strength of partnership as well as, the desire to turn the dial and use those authorities in a more forceful way.
Thank you. Xolisile, come to you on this one now.
Yeah, asset recovery, it's a very critical issue at the moment. And FATF has come up with some recommendations, which makes a lot of sense. One of the recommendations is that we need to have a national strategy, not an asset recovery office strategy or a revenue strategy, a revenue office strategy, but a country state strategy on asset recovery. If countries that have that strategy, they seem to be doing better than others. But what is also critical is the right laws, as I've said. You need to have both the civil recovery, which is quick, which doesn't even depend on whether a person is alive or is absconded or is not known. But you are just taking an asset that is dated, that represents the proceeds of crime or that represents the benefit. But FATF stresses it in your laws, that in your laws allow your laws to even take assets that are of an equivalent value or corresponding value of what you have lost. So that really goes a long way if you've got a strong law. But the second issue is collaboration. If you don't have your FIU, your Financial Intelligence Unit, working with your Asset Recovery Unit and your police, then you are not able to move. But if you've got that collaboration, once an asset has been identified, you are able to bring police on board, you are able to bring an FIU, and an FIU using its suspension of freezing powers freezes that bank account. Other countries will freeze for 7 days, others it will be 30, others it's more. Then you have your asset recovery during that freezing process, drafting the papers. It works very well. We've done it in South Africa. We've got what we call a tripartite alliance, where we had the Asset Recovery Office together with the police sitting in an FIU and even using STRs to be able to do forfeiture cases. During COVID time, we had a very beautiful case of a guy who got a lot of tenders during COVID, didn't deliver, bought a lot of cars for family members, and those cars were on social media. We were able, without even having a complainant to come and open a case, we're able, in that tripartite agreement, to move and freeze assets. So the collaboration is very critical in having the right laws. But what we've seen other countries doing in Europe, some of them are also doing it in Africa, like Mauritius, and can't remember whether it's Zimbabwe. Yeah, they've got the unexplained wealth orders. If all of us really can learn from the countries who are doing well on unexplained wealth orders, we can really see an increase in the value of asset recovery.
Thank you. Some really tangible actions there, and some interesting outcomes described as well. Chris, anything you'd want to add on this particular one?
I agree with that. Particularly non-conviction-based asset recovery, unexplained wealth orders, and making sure they were used effectively is key. Just throw in a couple of other hopefully interesting or useful ideas. I mean, one of the areas that I used to get very frustrated about in law enforcement was the speed with which criminals could move money across borders, 13, 14 jurisdictions in a day. And then if you tried to follow that money through international letters of request and the mechanisms that exist, you were probably talking years to trace that money. So it's back to that inequality of arms. So a couple of ideas. I think Interpol have just set up this concept of a silver notice, which is the ability to broadcast an asset that needs to be recovered to any Interpol member. That works really well for physical assets, a yacht or something. I think there's some really it's very powerful. I'd love to see some thinking around how you can use that for more liquid assets as well. Use the Interpol silver notice to trace cash around the global system as well. And then in that same context around using data that already sits in aggregation, in the past in law enforcement, when I'd worked with banks that were global banks, they could often see global movements of money much more quickly than you could ever follow them. So if you can find a way to bring the FIUs closer together, to allow those banks that see those global transactions to share that global data much more quickly, much more freely with those who need it, that would allow us to get to the end point and freeze the account quickly. And I think that's the key piece. We need to bring up the pace here in relation to asset recovery, and hopefully there's a couple of ideas about how we can do it.
Thank you, Chris. And your injection of pace is what leads us to actually the last question of today, and that is the observation that our criminal networks are remarkably adept at evolving their methods, and they do it quickly. Mm-hmm. How is it possible for justice organisations to keep up with this? And Annette, if you want to lead out on that one.
Yeah, for sure. I think that concept of nimbleness by design has got to start, permeating discussions. And, I talked about, the Canadian regime change towards private-to-private information sharing and the ability for, coalitions of banks or other private sector entities to come forward and say, listen, here's a problem that we're trying to address. Here's how we want to address it, and get it approved and then roll it. Right, like that was meant to be by design, both technology neutral, threat neutral, and it's something that could evolve with time. So, bringing that speed of the private sector, into a challenge that involves governments being able to provide authorities and so on. I think we're going to need to think more carefully about that. And not just nimbleness by design, but privacy by design. And FATF is working quite hard right now towards that objective that Chris described of using the data that's already there in payments networks and so on. I think the issue will be how to set joint priorities so that there'll be an ability to move quickly and take advantage of the highest value information and pull together those coalitions quickly without having to seek authorities at the same time. So setting the rules in advance, giving a sense of what constitutes a shared threat, knowing who can, say yes, press go. These are all things that we, I think, can work through now and and essentially do the upfront work with legal colleagues so that the challenges won't need new authorities as we go along.
I've not heard of nimbleness by design, but I like it. I'm going to be using that from now on. Xolisile, anything on this sort of?
Yeah, can I just go back a bit on the issues of Chris's touch on the issues of FIUs, that if they can do a lot when it comes to sharing information so that we can see the increase in asset recovery. FIUs are already doing that. I remember one case that got an award, the best case award, about 2 or 3 years ago. It was a case of Latvia, where it was 25 FIUs forming a task force working with the private sector. And in that case, there are about more than 30 asset recovery applications in a number of jurisdictions. So FIUs do exchange information speedily as possible using a secured platform. Or when it comes to the issue that you have raised right now, the public sector, it's really sad that the public sector, whether it's law enforcement agencies or its regulators, in a number of countries, even rich countries, it's really not capacitated. We've got more cases, more organized crime cases than we have officials in law enforcement agencies dealing with these matters. So governments, the governments and the heads of governments, directors, director generals need to speak out and not say, I want to safeguard my job. Need to speak up and repeatedly until they are heard about the issues of resources. What we see in most cases is when a country is assessed, then the Financial Action Task Force will come and make an action in that country and say, increase the number of staffs in your FIU, increase the number of staff in your investigating team or in your prosecution so that they can do more money laundering cases. And when you have a few people, and those people need to show that they've done something at the end of the day, they'll focus on easy cases, easy to win cases, not your high profile cases that are voluminous and that will take time. So we need to ensure that the government the public sector is prioritized, and politicians are showing a strong political will by capacitating the fight against financial crime. That for me is very, very critical. But I'll just give you an example because we are failing. I think most of the countries are failing. In my country, in South Africa, when we assessed, it was one of our action in the action plan that we need to increase staff in the police, in our FIU, and in even one of the regulators. But government has attended to it. But we've even done more now. We have even our president saying business assist the public sector. We've got what we call business against crime, putting a lot of money in financial investigation. They will even pay firms in big cases and say, can you do a financial analysis and assist law enforcement agencies in this matter, even in asset recovery cases. So we all have a role to fight here, including business. I always say when it comes to fighting crime, we need a whole of society approach. So we're doing bad at the moment, even when it comes to IT tools, technology in government is not there. You still see manual counting, manual processing or screening of STRs, and that needs to change. We need to ensure that our leaders, political leaders, capacitate the public sector.
I wholeheartedly agree. And Chris, I'm sure you're going to lend your support to that key point there.
Oh, 100%, yeah. The final point I'd make just on the pace point though, Richard, is around data and I suppose the exploitation of data. And I think we talk about AI as almost the solution to everything, but also in the criminal world as a growing threat. You know, it'll drive up fraud, etc. And absolutely that is a threat. But I think we need to start thinking around how through our information sharing legislation, through the trust, through the partnerships we're building up, through the data that we're able to sort of bring together or analyze collectively, how we can apply AI to that data so that we start to see criminal patterns more quickly, can share them more quickly, can trace those assets more quickly, and disrupt crime more quickly. So turn it into an advantage to us rather than a threat.
Very good. Okay, so we have covered a lot of ground from FATF to FIUs via David Lewis, or from Canada to South Africa via, dare I say it, Chris's yachts. We've covered some broad topics in a short space of time. So it's my job to bring this to a close now. First of all, I'd like to thank our panel, to Annette, to Xolisile, to Chris. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our listeners out there. Hopefully you took some new points from this, but for me, a few things stood out. It stood out that illicit finance can't be addressed in silos. I think we know this, and I think, unfortunately, historically, some of the modus operandi across the financial crime system has not been operating fully effectively across those silos. But the good news is that increasingly stakeholders are recognizing this and are acting on the need to reach out, the need to collaborate, the need to coordinate, to act as one across borders. It's only solutions that are cross-border, that are cross-sector, that can effectively battle this complex and widespread challenge. So, if you'd like to learn more about some of the solutions we've discussed today, please do check out our reports and reports from organisations like Annette's and Xolisile. And ours is called Combating Illicit Finance, Driving Effective Response Across the Judicial Ecosystem. And this can be found on Deloitte.com. Also, please look out for our Justice Reimagined report and series, where we will continue to explore topics like today across the broader justice system, and looking at how we can enable a safer, more secure and prosperous society. So one final thank you to our panelists, and that brings our session today to a close. Thank you from me.